before Victoria Harmon ever became a name people whispered about in Ridgemont, before she landed on the cover of the local business magazine, before she gave that keynote at the Chamber of Commerce dinner where half the room couldn't take their eyes off her, our paths crossed in a way that neither of us thought twice about at the time. I was 22, working a double shift at Anderson Machine Works. The kind of place where the floor shook when the presses ran and you came home smelling like cutting oil no matter how long you showered. My father had put in 16 years there before a back injury forced him into early retirement. I was the one who took his place, not because I had no other options, but because I genuinely loved the work. There was something satisfying about turning a block of raw metal into something precise, something that fit perfectly into a larger system. I used to sketch gear configurations on the back of napkins during lunch breaks. The guys teased me for it. I didn't care. Victoria walked into the plant one afternoon with her father, Gerald Harmon, the owner of Harmon Industrial Supply, the company that provided our tooling consumables. She was home from college for the summer, tagging along on a client visit the way rich kids sometimes did when they had nothing better to do. She wore a white linen blouse that had no business being inside a machine shop. She looked around at the equipment with polite disinterest, the way someone looks at a museum exhibit they didn't choose to visit. I was recalibrating a CNC lathe when she stopped near my station. She watched me for a moment. "Does it always smell like this in here?" she asked. I kept my eyes on the machine. "You get used to it." She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and moved on with her father. That was the entire conversation. I thought nothing of it. 4 years passed. I left Anderson Machine Works and put myself through night school, finishing a degree in industrial engineering while working days at a small precision parts company across town. I wasn't flashy about any of it. I just kept my head down and built things. My first patent application was filed the week after my graduation, a tool holder design that reduced vibration in high-speed machining. Nothing glamorous. But it was mine. I ran into Victoria again at a fundraiser my company sent me to represent. She was there with her father doing the rounds. She was sharper than I remembered, more deliberate in how she carried herself. The easy confidence of someone who had always known where she stood in a room. She recognized me before I recognized her. "Machine shop," she said. "Anderson, right? You were fixing something when I walked through." I was surprised she remembered. "Recalibrating," I said. "There's a difference." She smiled at that. "A real one, not the polished social version. My father says you filed patents." He mentioned your name when a client brought up the design. We talked for an hour. When the evening ended, she asked for my card. 2 weeks later, she called to ask if I wanted to grab coffee. I told her I wasn't much of a coffee person, but I knew a good diner that made decent pie. She said that sounded perfect. That was how it started. Victoria was brilliant, genuinely so, and I want to be honest about that because it matters to the story. She had a business degree and an instinct for market positioning that I admired. She could read a room in 30 seconds and know exactly which relationships to cultivate. Where I thought in systems and tolerances, she thought in leverage and timing. We were different in ways that felt complementary at first. Her father liked me. Gerald Harmon was a self-made man who had built Harmon Industrial from a single warehouse and a used truck. He respected people who worked with their hands and understood production floors. He told me once, over dinner at his house, that I was the first person his daughter had brought home who could actually talk to him about what he did for a living. I took that seriously. We dated for 2 years. I proposed on a Saturday morning in my kitchen, not at some rooftop restaurant with a string quartet. I had made breakfast and she was reading something on her phone and I just said it, quietly, across the table. She looked up. She said yes. I think she was a little surprised by how calm I was about it. I wasn't calm inside, but I had learned early that steadiness was a form of respect. Her mother, Diane, was a different matter entirely. Diane Harmon had grown up with money and had very specific ideas about what her daughter's life should look like. She was not unkind to me outright. It was more subtle than that. The way she would reference my apartment, my car, my family background in a tone that made everything sound like a gentle obstacle. At the engagement dinner, she asked in front of everyone whether I had given any thought to long-term financial stability. My mother, sitting 2 seats away, stiffened. I put my hand on the table and answered the question without flinching. Gerald looked at his wife with the expression of a man who had apologized for the same person many times. Victoria laughed it off later. "She does that with everyone," she said. "Don't take it personally." I noted that she didn't tell her mother to stop. We married in the fall. Small ceremony, which I preferred. Victoria wore something simple and looked extraordinary in it. Gerald walked her down the aisle and shook my hand at the altar for a long time, longer than protocol required, looking at me with something that felt like relief. I had been with Harmon Industrial for 8 months by then, hired as operations director after Gerald decided to expand into contract manufacturing. It was an unusual arrangement. My wife's father was my employer, and I was careful about it. Every decision I made professionally I made as if someone were auditing it. I documented everything. I was never late. I never used the family connection to cut corners. Gerald noticed. He gave me more responsibility in quiet, practical ways. The kind that didn't require announcements. The first 2 years of marriage were good. Victoria was traveling frequently, working the sales side of the business, building client relationships. I was rebuilding the operations side, implementing lean manufacturing principles that cut waste and improved delivery times. We had separate rhythms, but they fit together well enough. We were busy people who genuinely liked each other. Then the texture of things began to change, so gradually that I almost missed it. Victoria started coming home later. Not unreasonably late at first. Business dinners ran long. Client events went into the evening. I understood that world. I didn't question it. But there was a shift in how she came home. Something slightly unfocused, slightly too casual, the way a person acts when they're managing their expression rather than just having one. She started making small comments about the house. The neighborhood wasn't right. The furniture was too plain. Other couples in her social circle were renovating, upgrading, moving to the newer developments on the east side of town. I told her I'd rather pay off what we had. She started calling it my blue-collar mindset, in a tone she probably thought was affectionate. At a company event, a client appreciation dinner, 40 people in a private room at a downtown restaurant, one of the sales reps made a joke about someone on the floor being promoted above their pay grade. Victoria laughed and glanced at me, and in that glance I caught something I was not supposed to see. Not malice exactly. More like a private agreement with someone else's joke at my expense. I didn't say anything that night. I drove us home and made sure my face gave nothing away. But I started paying attention differently after that. I noticed that her phone went face down when I sat beside her in the evenings. I noticed that she took calls in other rooms. I noticed the specific way she said the name Derek, too neutrally, the way you say a name when you've practiced it. Derek Cass was a regional sales consultant who worked with several of her clients. Mid-40s, divorced, well-dressed in the way of someone who spent money on visible things. I called an investigator named Paul, someone a colleague had used during a business dispute. I gave him the basics and told him I wanted documentation, not confrontations. What Paul found over the next 3 months was thorough. Hotel receipts in cities where Victoria was traveling for client meetings. Photographs. A phone number that appeared on her records dozens of times a month. Derek Cass, confirmed. It had been going on for at least a year. I want to be clear about something. I was not blindsided in the emotional sense people imagine when they picture a betrayed spouse. The evidence confirmed what I had already calculated. What I felt was not shock. It was a kind of heavy, quiet clarity. The feeling of a system finally reading out an error code you had been watching build for months. I did not confront her. I thanked Paul, paid him, and filed the reports in a folder on an external drive that I kept at my office. Then I went to see Craig Elwood. Craig had been my attorney since I filed my first patent. He was meticulous, unhurried, and had the particular gift of saying serious things in an ordinary tone of voice. I laid everything out for him. The marriage, the business structure, the investigation findings, my position at Harmon Industrial, and what I wanted to accomplish. Craig listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Before we talk about exits, let's talk about architecture." That was the right word for it. Gerald owned 60% of Harmon Industrial. Victoria and her older brother Richard each held 15% as non-voting shares inherited when the company was restructured several years earlier. The remaining 10% was held by 2 longtime employees. Gerald ran everything. Richard, to his credit, mostly stayed out of operations and ran a separate logistics firm. Victoria had a seat at the table by inheritance, not by function. My position was operations director, salaried, no equity. I had brought significant value to the company. 2 efficiency programs I designed had increased net margins by a combined 11 points over 3 years. But I had no ownership stake. That was the first thing to address. Craig and I drafted a proposal. I would present it to Gerald as a straightforward retention and incentive structure, a modest equity grant in exchange for a multi-year commitment and the formalization of several operational improvements I had been implementing. Craig framed the numbers conservatively. Gerald, who was 71 and thinking about succession, had reasons of his own to take it seriously. I presented it on a Tuesday morning. Gerald read through the documents twice. He asked 3 questions about the vesting structure, 1 about tax treatment, and none about my marriage. He signed at the bottom of the 3rd page and told me to have Craig finalize the paperwork. I walked out of that meeting holding 3% of Harmon Industrial with a vesting schedule that would bring me to 8 over the following 4 years. Victoria did not know. She had not been present for the meeting. She had been in Cincinnati that week visiting a client, or visiting Derek Cass. At that point, the distinction had stopped mattering to me. What mattered was the next part. Richard Harmon was, as I have said, mostly reasonable. He had his father's practical intelligence and none of his sister's social ambitions. He ran a clean operation and stayed in his lane. But his business had been struggling since a major client defected to a competitor 18 months earlier. And I knew from casual conversations that he was sitting on a cash flow problem he hadn't fully solved. I had lunch with Richard in February at a barbecue place he liked near his warehouse. I didn't waste his time. I told him I was planning to make a significant investment in the company and was interested in acquiring additional equity to support a long-term growth strategy. I told him Gerald was aware of my intentions. I told him I would pay fair value in cash within 30 days. Richard chewed his food and thought for a while. "Victoria won't like it," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me with the specific expression of an older sibling who has watched a younger sibling create problems for a long time. "What's going on between you two?" "I'm handling it carefully," I said, "and I'd rather do it right than do it fast." Richard nodded slowly. He understood careful. 2 weeks later, his attorney and Craig had a conversation. The terms were straightforward. Richard's 15% transferred to me for a number that covered his cash flow problem with room to spare. I now held 18% of Harmon Industrial. Gerald held 60. The 2 employee shareholders held 10. Victoria held 15, unchanged, unaware of any of this. The next step required patience, which I had in abundance. Gerald's health had been declining in a way he minimized publicly, but couldn't hide from people who saw him daily. He tired more easily. He was delegating things he had never delegated before. One morning he called me into his office, closed the door, and told me he was thinking about his succession plan. "I built this company so my kids would have something," he said. "But Richard has his own business and Victoria." He stopped. He looked at the window for a moment. "Victoria is not her mother, but she has her mother's habits. You understand what I mean?" I told him I understood. "I need someone who will run this the right way," he said. "Someone who knows the floor as well as the boardroom. Someone the employees trust." He looked at me steadily. "I need to restructure how the voting rights are allocated before anything else happens. I want to do it while I still can." Craig spent 6 weeks working with Gerald's estate attorney on the restructuring. When it was complete, Gerald had formally transferred voting control over his shares to a management trust. The trustee, responsible for exercising those votes in the best interest of the company's long-term operations, was me. Combined with my own 18%, I now held effective voting control over 78% of Harmon Industrial. Victoria held 15%, non-voting. I did not tell her. I should explain what was happening in our house during all of this, because I don't want the sequence to make it sound colder than it was. I was not a man running a calculated operation from behind a mask of normalcy. I was also just a person living inside a marriage that had gone wrong, coming home every night to a house where the distance between 2 people in the same room had become physical enough to feel. Victoria was not cruel to me, not in the explicit way. She had simply reclassified me in her own mind, from partner to fixture. She spoke to me the way you speak to a reliable appliance. She was pleasant when she needed something and absent when she didn't. The Derek situation was ongoing. Paul confirmed it in a brief update call I asked for in March. We did not have children. That had been Victoria's consistent preference, communicated clearly before we married and unchanged since. I had accepted it. Now I was glad of it. There were no small people in our house who would be caught in whatever came next. I came home early on a Wednesday afternoon in April and found her on the back porch with a glass of wine, video calling someone she tilted the phone away from when she heard me come in. She recovered quickly. She asked about my day. I told her it was productive. She said that was good. We ate dinner at opposite ends of an emotional spectrum and both pretended we were in the same place. The next morning I called Paul and told him I had enough. Then I called Craig and told him it was time. Craig had been preparing the divorce filing for 2 months. We had every document in order. The investigation findings, the financial disclosures, the equity records, the prenuptial agreement Victoria and I had signed before the wedding. The prenuptial had been her suggestion, actually, proposed through her mother's attorney to protect her inheritance. Craig had reviewed it at the time and made one specific addition, at my request, that neither Victoria nor her attorney had pushed back on, a clause establishing that any equity acquired independently through my professional work was my separate property. At the time, Victoria had assumed that clause was largely irrelevant. I was a salaried employee with no equity. She was the one with inherited shares. She had not anticipated Gerald. The filing was delivered on a Thursday. Victoria called me 17 times between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. I let them go to voicemail. At 2:15, I stepped out of a production meeting, called her back, and told her I was sorry this was happening by phone, but that I had wanted her to have time to reach her attorney before we spoke. She was not interested in that framing. "You can't do this," she said. "We have a life. We have this house. I don't understand where this is coming from." I told her it had been coming for a long time and that I thought she knew that. There was a pause. Then her voice changed, went tighter. "What is this really about, Daniel? Is this about the business? Because you think you're going to use this divorce to get your hands on my shares, I don't need your shares," I said. Another pause. Longer. I let her think through the arithmetic. She came to the office the next morning. She did not come to my office. She went directly to Gerald's. I found out later from Sally, his longtime assistant, that the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Gerald was not unkind to his daughter, but he was clear. He had made his decisions. He believed they were the right ones. He told her that what happened between Victoria and me was between us, and that the company's structure was separate from our marriage. Victoria came to find me after. She stood in the doorway of my office with her arms crossed and her face arranged into something that was trying to be controlled. "You went behind my back," she said. "I built a career," I said, "the same way your father did. You used him. I served this company well for 5 years. Your father would disagree with your characterization." She looked at the wall behind me where I had recently hung a framed photograph. Gerald and me at a trade show 2 years earlier, both of us standing next to a piece of equipment we had jointly negotiated into the plant. She stared at it for a moment. "He was always more proud of you than he ever let on to me," she said. There was something real in her voice just then, something underneath the anger. I almost felt the pull of it. But I also remembered a dining room, 40 people, a laugh, a glance I was not supposed to catch. "I think you should talk to your attorney," I said. "There's a lot to sort through." She tried several more approaches over the following weeks. She suggested counseling, which I declined. She suggested a separation instead of a full divorce, which I also declined. She suggested that my equity position was a conflict of interest that could be legally challenged, which her attorney apparently told her quickly it was not. She suggested that she had not been herself lately, that she was going through something, that I owed her the benefit of the doubt. I was not unmoved by all of this. I want to be honest about that too. 8 years is a long time. There were real things between us at the start. Real warmth. Letting go of what something was supposed to be is its own kind of grief, separate from the anger. But I had documentation. 18 months of it. And I had asked Paul to stop gathering it for a reason, not because I had enough to hurt her, but because I already had more than I needed to be fair, and I didn't want to be cruel. I wanted to be done, cleanly, correctly. The divorce was finalized 7 months after I filed. Victoria kept the house. She bought out my half using a portion of her shares as collateral, which her attorney structured at terms I thought were generous on my part and which she later acknowledged through Craig were fair. She retained her 15% stake in Harmon Industrial, now explicitly non-voting per the restructured articles. She was entitled to dividends if the company declared them, which under my operational management it would, reasonably, in time. She did not get alimony. The prenuptial held. Her attorney had tried to argue the equity transfers constituted marital property, and Craig had quietly dismantled that argument with the precise documentation we had been building for 2 years. Derek Cass, I heard through a mutual acquaintance about 6 months later, had gone back to his ex-wife. I found I had nothing to feel about that. I moved back into the apartment I had kept as a rental property, the one I had owned since before the marriage. I had maintained it, kept it in good condition, never sold it. Some people thought that was odd. I thought it was practical. It turns out I had been right about that too. Gerald came to see me there one Sunday morning about a year after everything was settled. He brought coffee, which he knew I didn't drink, and a box of pastries from the bakery 2 blocks from his house. We sat at my kitchen table and he told me he was going to reduce his active role over the next 18 months, and that he wanted the transition to be gradual and well documented. He also told me he was sorry. I told him he didn't need to be. He had raised his daughter the best he knew how. What she had done was her own choice. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "She used to tell her mother you'd never amount to anything. Back when you were still at Anderson, before you two were together, her mother agreed. I never said anything." He shook his head. I should have said something. I told him what mattered to me was what he had seen since then. He nodded. He picked up a pastry and ate half of it. Then he said, "You know, the day you walked into that fundraiser, I told Diane that night that you were the most composed young man in the room. She said you were just a machinist." He smiled, small and tired. I told her composure wasn't a thing you inherited. I thought about that for a long time after he left, about what it means to be seen by the right person at the right moment, about how much of a life turns on those small, accurate judgments, the ones made quietly, without fanfare, that take years to prove themselves correct. I run Harmon Industrial now, not as a son-in-law managing up, but as the person who understands it most completely. Its history, its inefficiencies, its potential. The floor crew, most of whom remember me from when I was implementing the first efficiency program, treat me with the particular respect that comes from watching someone earn something over time. That matters to me more than the title. I still sketch things on napkins. I still come home smelling like cutting oil sometimes, on days when I go to the floor instead of staying in the office, which is most days. Victoria and I do not speak. She attends the annual shareholder meeting when she chooses to, which is infrequently. The one time our eyes met across the conference table, she looked away first. I did not feel triumphant about that. I felt something closer to tired, and underneath that, a small, persistent gratitude that I had been careful, that I had done it right, that I had not let anger make me ugly. There is a photograph on my office wall now. Gerald and me, same one. Some of the people who come in for meetings ask about it. I tell them it is a picture of someone who taught me that the most important work is almost always invisible from the outside. They usually nod and move on to the agenda. I let them.